Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I wanted to give you a few ideas about two of the literary elements that we'll be discussing this week. The first one being setting, and the second one being point of view. These PowerPoints are also in the week 2 content folder without my narration, so if you want to go through them at your leisure or by yourself, you don't need to listen to me necessarily lecture. But here we go. So setting, when I think about it, is 3 W's. We're talking about the where, we're talking about the when, and we're talking about the weather. And work may have several settings. We're going to see that in some of this week's stories. And when we're thinking about the setting, it's the context for where the action occurs. It's the time of day, the time of year, the place itself, and everything that place brings with it. And then finally, the culture of that place. You have 2 different levels of setting, macro and micro. Now, macro ideas about setting are big picture things. Things like culture, time period, and general ideas about place. Micro setting ideas or details are very specific images that an author uses to fill those setting ideas. So for example, if we see here my dog Abby, the macro setting would be nature. It might be summer, might even be mid part of the day. And then the micro setting details are going to be, the moss on the log, or the rock behind her green leash collar. Those are more specific to the place. So big idea, small idea. We have 2 different types of setting. You can have backdrop settings and integral settings. Backdrop settings are places that we don't get a lot of specific information about. They're very generalized. In a story that has a backdrop setting, you might have character or symbol be more important than necessarily setting. I like to think of a backdrop setting as a story you could literally take and set in a different place, and the story could still happen and still occur. The setting isn't that crucial. Then we have integral settings, settings that are essential to understanding character, understanding the conflict, and we usually get lots of detail with integral settings. If you think about The Interlopers, the story from week 1, we got a fair amount of detail about that land. What kind of trees it had, what kind of game it had, what it looked like on that darkest evening of the year. It was an integral setting. Not only did we get a lot of details, but it was also certainly important to understanding both the main characters, their families, and the conflicts, both the external conflict over that land or the internal conflicts that the main characters felt. When we're talking about setting, we're talking about time. And that could be clock time, what time of day it is, calendar time, what month of the year it is, seasonal time, fall, winter, spring, summer. Those are always really important elements to me in a story. And in historical time, certainly you can read novels or short stories or plays which are set in particularly important historical time periods. Now, finally, as something that I think is really important to think about when you're thinking about setting, is not only the details that the author uses, but the reason why the author is using the setting, the function of the setting, how the author is using the setting. And here are some ideas about that. An author could set the mood with the setting. Certainly Interlopers, set on the darkest evening of the year, sets a particularly tense and dramatic mood. Settings can illuminate character. They can tell us about people. We're going to see this in the novel we read, in the play that we read. We're going to see it in the stories that we read for this week as well. Place informs us about people. Place tells us about who somebody is. Even if you think about your own home or places that you've lived, I'm sure there were certain details that would relate to an observer who you are based on the setting that we're seeing. Settings can provide conflict or act as an antagonist, act as an enemy. Interlopers is a great example of that. Settings can function as a symbol. They can represent an idea or an emotion. Now, just as an aside here, I think the Interlopers use the setting in this way. There's that very dramatic moment when they when the two main characters see each other, they're about ready to engage in a gunfight, it seems, and a deed of nature's own violence occurs, knocking the tree over, this beech tree, and trapping them underneath it. And it's described as slashing the skin of one of the characters' face, so blood goes into his eyes, and he's kind of blinded by that blood. And then also, I think it's described as a thick strewn of broken twigs and shattered branches all around these men. You know, what that makes me think about is all of the lives that were lost or affected by this land dispute. 3 generations, going back 3 generations. There probably were, you know, broken twigs and destroyed limbs of different family lines that were affected by this land battle. And that tree, for me, comes to suggest similar elements of what has happened in both Ulrich and Georg's families. Von Gradwitz's and the Zanums have been shattered for years and years and years over this bitter land dispute. You know, finally, the setting can embody theme, and that can reflect what the story is trying to say about life. Again, if we go back to the Interlopers, the way that ends, with wolves coming down the hill, and really ending that generation of the dispute, that tells us something about what Saki might have been trying to suggest in writing the story and ending it that way. So those are some setting ideas. Now this slide in particular is an important one. I would kind of set these different bullet points down in your notebook. When we do setting analysis, and you're going to be asked to do that a couple different times this semester, I will ask you, what's the function of the setting? What is the author trying to do with the setting? These are some ways that an author can use setting. There's some other ones as well. This is not a completely comprehensive list, but it'll give you some stuff to think about. Now, the other thing I wanted to share with you is about point of view. Point of view is who is telling us the story. And generally, a narrator will be telling us the story, a voice. That narrator, the speaker, the person who is telling us the story, sometimes that person is in the story. Sometimes they're not in the story. Sometimes they know everything. They have omniscient knowledge. They can voice what's happening in one character's head or another character's head. And sometimes they only know one perspective or one side of the story. You know, if we think about the Interlopers, the narrator was on the outside of the story and had knowledge of both Ulrich and Georg's thoughts. Even, you know, some other, you know, backstory was expressed through the narration in that story. And so, in that case, we had what is known as third-person point of view. It's somebody outside the story, a non-participant, voicing the story. There's 4 basic types. There's omniscient, which is all-knowing. We see into many different characters' minds. We get a grand perspective of a place. Limited, seeing into one major character, or limited, seeing into one minor character. And then objective, really not delving into any character's thoughts. When you read the stories for this week, think about what type of third-person narration is being used. With all 3 of the stories we're reading, they all use third person. Now they use varying, I think, types of third person. So ask yourself, am I seeing in one character's mind more than another? Am I seeing in everyone's characters? Am I really not seeing anyone's perspective? And that will lead you towards the type of third person narration that the authors are using. There's also first-person narration. We're going to come into some stories next week that deal with first-person narration. This is the narrator as a participant. The story is happening to them. They're relating it directly to us. They have limited knowledge, like we all do, because we're stuck in our brains. But it's usually a major character, sometimes a minor character, reporting the story to us. There's second-person. We're not going to read any second-person stories. They deal with the you perspective. You know, instead of I went to the store or he went to the store, it would be you went to the store. It's a strange narrative technique. It can be a very provocative one. I've read a number of great short stories that use it. You know, recipe books, self-help books, those dummy chess for dummies or Minecraft for dummies. They use those kinds of you perspective. It definitely results in attention getting directness, and it stands out from the other types. So that's what we have here for you. Setting and point of view. Two different literary elements. When you're reading the stories this week, please consider both the place that the story is taking place in and how that story is told to us, what knowledge do we get, and how those decisions by the author affects our experience of the stories. That's one of the questions we'll come back to time and time again. Why did the author make that decision, and what did that decision result in for us, for the reader, for the person experiencing the story? Take care. We'll be talking about another literary element next week.